precepts, or the sort of the moral guidelines of Zen, are really seen as pretty intrinsic to our practice. So we have the practice of settling the mind and doing that in kind of formal and informal meditation. And then we also have this offering, which is what could be termed, I suppose, moral guidelines. And we have all these different ways of looking at these in our practice. And it's almost, I mean, I to be perfectly honest, I feel kind of nervous right now because there's so much that could be said, and I just want to try to distill something down to what is useful. So the precept that we worked with this morning, or one of the precepts we mentioned this morning, and it's the topic of the talk because we're going through them sequentially, is not being deluded nor encouraging others to do so. Not being deluded or encouraging others to do so. And then the recommendation is, I will cultivate a mind that sees clearly. I will embrace all experience directly. So I think that's really critical to bring up, because why devote ourselves to these precepts? Why are they of value? And if we want to be able to see our lives clearly and cultivate a mind of awareness, and why would we want to do that? And embrace experience directly, because sometimes embracing experience directly is painful. So why would we want to do that? So I think that's important to ask ourselves. Why would we want to practice these precepts? And so the precept, in a certain sense, is advice. So like I said, anything I say is just going to be one small element to the whole equation. But if we look at it in a certain sense, like one of the ways that the Buddha is talked about as the great physician or the great doctor, because what he said, as far as we understand, is really diagnosing suffering, that life has in it this element of suffering. And it's not because we're doing something wrong. It's just there is suffering in life. And what are the causes of that suffering? So that's what he talked about in the Four Noble Truths. And so this precept is looking at, how do I cloud my awareness of seeing life directly? And so we talk about that in a lot of different ways. One of the ways the precept is kind of, I think, traditionally talked about is around intoxicants. So literal intoxicants, so drugs and alcohol. And we were having a conversation about this earlier today. How do those things cloud our awareness? How do they keep us from embracing experience directly? They're an experience of themselves, right? So that's also an aspect of, in our practice, nothing gets left out. And there is the way of looking at it that there's no separation. So if one is intoxicated, that's included too. But when we're talking about, if we have a desire, if we have an intention to want to be as intimate with our life as it's happening, then what cultivates that? So kind of I was looking at it, again, it's, it's always limited, but I was looking at it from certain kind of levels. So in a way, actually being intoxicated is maybe a kind of gross level of looking at it. Like when we're completely out of it, um, how much are we even in touch with that? Or we're, lying on the bed spinning, or completely captured by, our own thoughts, or uh, really separate even from the social situation that we're in. And also what kinds of shadow aspects of ourselves come up when we're intoxicated. A lot of violence and anger comes up for some people. So that's kind of one layer of, traditionally is said, this precept is actually, don't be intoxicated. And then I think for all of us, many of us, I would assume, there's this whole kind of level of intoxication of distraction. So being really preoccupied with our electronic devices, social media, and whatever form that takes for us, that again takes us away from the present moment and being aware. The thing I want to really, really, really emphasize is that this is not another way to beat ourselves up. That I'm bad if I do those things. So there is these three perspectives on the precepts. And one is a kind of a fundamentalist view. Just don't do it. And the thing about that is that in all of this, let's pay attention to what happens when we do that. So if we make a vow that I'm not going to drink or use drugs or be intoxicated, observe what happens. How does that work for us? So it's not because we're going to get some golden ticket because we do that. It's how does this help me cultivate awareness? How does this enable me to be more directly in touch with my experience? And so similarly with that level of distraction, when I don't reach for my phone first thing in the morning and say, okay, I'm just going to sit on the couch and I'm going to drink my coffee and I'm going to pay attention to what's happening outside, the birds, the breeze, the lighting. How does that help me to cultivate my awareness of what's happening as opposed to getting drawn into everything else? We are all super familiar with this, I assume. And then another way to look at the precepts is from a relational perspective. So for a lot of people, from what I understand, like their relationships, let's say on Facebook, which probably for some of you is not how you relate, Instagram, however it is, facilitates communication, facilitates relationship. So what is the dosage? What is the time, place, person, and amount that makes sense, that actually cultivates awareness? So that's a very Mahayana perspective. And it's not an absolutist perspective. But it still calls upon us to pay attention. All of it does. The bottom line is pay attention. Pay attention to what's happening. Pay attention to what's happening in my experience, in the sense we have of inside outside, which is really just a sense. And then there's also the perspective of we can't mess this up. We can't mess this up. You know, when we chanted the Bodhisattva vows, delusion is inexhaustible. We vow to transform. We vow to work with it. We vow to cultivate that awareness. But we're not going to get rid of it. This is part of our human experience. It's part of the experience of being in the world. So I wanted to share with you a couple of reflections. And I kind of, as an example of that Mahayana perspective too, like I just was thinking, if one has a lot of social anxiety, for example, and you're going into a social situation and having a glass of wine actually enables you to get out of your head and relax into that social situation. That's a more relational view of the precepts. Are you using an intoxicant to actually be more present? So that's where this is it. It requires a lot of responsibility for ourselves, and not externalizing that, not saying, you know, well, these are these rules that I have to follow, and I'm a bad person if I don't. It's really, how do I cultivate the intention that I have? If the intention is to be awake and alive and intimate with life as it's happening, that's the kind of basis of our practice. So if that's your intention, what facilitates that? I had occasion to read something by Norman Fisher earlier this week, who's a Buddhist teacher and kind of in our, you know, he's from Suzuki Roshi's lineage, so they're sort of like Dharma cousins of ours. And he said this thing of the Buddha is compared to a doctor because he treated the suffering that ails all of us. His diagnosis and cure is called the Four Noble Truths. And then he said, putting us right with our inmost hearts is the larger goal of all religions, including Buddhism. In Buddhist terms, we are more than the body and its associated mental and emotional states. We are perhaps most saliently Buddha nature, or awareness itself, luminous consciousness, obscured only by defilements. And so those defilements traditionally are talked about as greed, anger, and ignorance. And that's where we circle back to the precepts. And he says the defilements are talked about as refraining from using intoxicants that cloud the mind. So I just feel like it's really important for us to be centered on why. How does this serve what our intention is? And all these different ways of looking at it are opportunities for consideration. And I looked at our Jukai workbook that we used when we went through studying about taking the precepts, so Jukai, taking the precepts, almost 2 years ago now, right? Yeah, I think so. Fukan saying, I think so. Anyway, there's one of the, it's great material. And one of the iterations is these practice slogans. And a couple that I highlighted is make a commitment to being present, don't ignore Buddha nature, and embrace experience directly. So these are practice slogans around not being deluded, not being ignorant. One of the ways ignorance is talked about is just not ignoring the truth, which is really hard to do sometimes. I was noticing in myself I shared something with a friend, and he didn't respond in the way that I would fantasize him responding. And I was noticing this embrace all experience directly, because what I wanted to do was either get angry about that or rationalize that he really was responding the way I wanted him to, but he wasn't expressing it the way I wanted him to. And both of that were kind of BS. Like, the reality was he responded the way he did, and it didn't fulfill my fantasy or expectation about him. But to embrace experience directly was to actually just see that for what it was. So that's so subtle. We do that probably all the time, or many times in the day, let's say. So the next layer of the intoxication, which is kind of like the basic level of the intoxication, is not knowing who we really are. And our delusion is separation. Our delusion is not feeling like somehow we're fundamentally enough. Our delusion is we're not intrinsically, naturally intimate with everything. And interestingly enough, our meditation group here in town is going through each chapter, which is a Dharma talk in Seisen's book, Full Circle. And she gave a talk about the delusion of practice, meaning what we think we're going to get that we don't have. And at the very, very, very end of the chapter, well, it was a longer talk than some of her other talks. But at the very end, she said, so that the talk was entitled Delusion of Practice. And at the very end, she said, ignorance is not realizing our inherently awakened mind. It is already who you are. And you already have that Bodhi mind, the Bodhi mind, the mind that to seek awakening, because you're already showing up for a talk. So just sit, turning towards no thing, with the intention to cultivate your awakened mind. So that's kind of, in a way, we want to grade things. That's our fundamental delusion, is we're not whole and complete as we are. And we're not intrinsically connected to everything else. That we are separate. And in terms of certainly our practice, in terms of Zen practice, the center of what's offered is Zazen, is the meditation practice, in the sense of anything that helps us settle the mind to not be distracted by the delusions of all our beliefs and ideas and thoughts, often mostly about ourselves and the conditioned way that we look at the world and ourselves. When we can kind of get outside that box, or that what can feel like a cage, right? Then we can begin to see the fullness of who we really are. And that's why Zazen is emphasized. Again, not because, as someone who I used to know earlier in my life, put up a chart in the Zendo accounting for how much Zazen everybody was doing, and mostly making himself the star pupil. That is not the point. But that is why it's so emphasized in our practice, is that the meditation practice is the laboratory in which we get to really intimately experience all of that, all of the delusion, all of the thoughts and feelings and conditioning intimately, and see what else is there beyond that. Because there is. So something I read this morning, and apparently it's this guy named Raffaella and Palindri. He's an Italian Buddhist priest. So this is a little bit on the part of effort. He says, with discipline, we become the architects of our own growth, forging a path where inner development is not a consequence of circumstance, but a deliberate journey towards wisdom and fulfillment. So there is that aspect of efforting. There is that aspect of putting ourselves in a situation voluntarily, locking ourselves down a little bit, to give ourselves the opportunity to see and work with delusion for the sake of freedom and liberation. Not for the sake of anything else. Not for the sake of getting a gold star, or being a good student, or being well thought of. Just for the sake of being awake in our lives. So I think that's something I wanted to share. Hope it's useful. And we found something. There was something recently where Maizumi Roshi had written out, that what he saw as essential aspects of practice, and he was wisdom, samadhi, concentration, and precepts, and take these as an offering. We can take these as an offering of support for our own intentions, whatever they are. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you. And I think we could see if there's any comments for a few minutes.